Good morning. My name is Rob DeAndrea, and I'll be presenting on my recently published paper titled Climate and Human Impact on Vegetation and Fire in an Arid Colorado Plateau Ecosystem in Western North America. As an outline, we'll first discuss the monument, then the study sites, research questions, methods, results, discussion, conclusions, and acknowledgements. So the monument was established in 1996 to protect the area's vast resources. It was reduced in 2017 and then restored in 2021. It's managed by the Bureau of Land Management and surrounded by other federal and state managed lands. The climate is at the mean northern extent of the North American monsoon, with precipitation decreasing with decreasing elevation, and summer precipitation decreasing with increasing latitude. It's broken into two zones: the upland zone, sourced mainly with Pacific-sourced winter precipitation, and then the semi-desert and desert zones, mostly with summer precipitation sourced by the North American monsoon. For geography, the monument is split into three zones: the Grand Staircase in the west, the Plateau in the center, and the Escalante Canyons in the east. Vegetation in the monument can be divided into 6 zones: the subalpine zone at the highest elevations, and then below that in decreasing order you have mixed conifer, ponderosa woodlands, pinyon juniper, semi-desert scrub, and desert scrub and grassland. A quick discussion of paleoecology on the Colorado Plateau. Paleoecological records are derived from wetland sediments as well as arid sediments, such as pack rat middens and cave sediments. And these records show that plant communities have changed through time. Only one study is conducted in the monument. This dates to the late Holocene, only from 1300 to 9000 cal-year BP, and was derived from cave sediments. Records on the Colorado Plateau show that during the late Wisconsin, it was cooler and wetter than modern times. There was glaciation at the highest elevations, and plant elevations were depressed as much as 800 meters. During the early Holocene, the climate was warmer and wetter during the summers, and it was colder during the winters, and modern woodland plants established themselves at higher elevations. During the middle Holocene, it was warmer and drier than currently, and this is when plant communities established their near modern ranges. And then during the late Holocene, there were alternating periods of colder, wetter, and warmer, drier climate. 2 of these of interest being the medieval climate anomaly and the Little Ice Age. For the cultural record, the monument is characterized by archaic through historic records. The archaic was characterized by seasonal exploitation of resources. The terminal archaic was characterized by the introduction of domesticated plants for food. The formative is characterized by an increased reliance on agriculture and increased sedentism. The late prehistoric characterized by foraging and horticulture by the ancestral Paiute. And then historically, we have the Latter-day Saint settlement of Kanab with the introduction of grazing, agriculture, and fire suppression. Now on to the study sites. The first site is Lake Pasture. It's located on 50 Mile Mountain on the Caiparos Plateau in the wilderness study area. This is at a higher elevation in a seasonally wet meadow in a pinyon juniper woodlands. The cultural record at this site is interesting because during the early formative, we have the Escalante Fremont, most likely engaging in wetland agriculture. And then during the late formative, we have a unique blend of Fremont, virgin, and Kayenta culture. And these people are most likely practicing dryland farming. Then during the late prehistoric, we have the Caiparos Paiute, who were strictly non-agricultural according to ethnographic records. Historically, we have the settlement of Penguich at 1875 with the introduction of sheep and cattle grazing. On to the second study site, we have Meadow Canyon and Johnson Canyon. This is in the Grand Staircase and adjacent to the monument. This is at a lower elevation in a wet meadow and a pinyon juniper woodland. The cultural record at this site is unique in that we have the virgin ancestral Puebloans, likely practicing wetland and dryland farming between Pueblo 1 and Pueblo 3 times. And then we have the Kaibab Paiute engaged in irrigation horticulture during the late prehistoric, according to ethnographic records. Then we have the historic settlement of Kanab in 1858 and Johnson in 1871, with the introduction of livestock raising and agriculture. So on to the research questions. There were 3 research questions. Number 1, how do vegetation and fire histories differ over the elevation ranges of the sites? 2, what do the records reveal about prehistoric agriculture? And 3, what is the relative impact of natural climate variability and human land use through time in southern Utah? On to the methods. In the field, we collected 2 sediment cores, one from Lake Pasture and one from Meadow Canyon, and we collected 3 suites of pack rat middens from Meadow Canyon. In the lab, we conducted lithological analyses and magnetic susceptibility on the sediment cores, as well as age determination of the cores using C14 and plutonium analyses. And then we also conducted pollen and fungal spore analyses on the cores and the middens, and we conducted charcoal analyses on the cores. And then finally, we did plant macrofossil analysis where possible on the cores and on the middens. Now on to the results. For sediment description and chronology for Lake Pasture, we collected a 3-meter long core. The top was recovered from the Vibra core, and the bottom was recovered from the Livingston core. And this likely represents the complete record. The chronology for this core is based on 7 radiocarbon dates from stratigraphic charcoal. 1 radiocarbon date from root material was rejected, and we utilized a plutonium activity profile to determine the location of 1963 to 64 in the core. Sediment description and chronology from Meadow Canyon. This core was 5 meters long. It was collected using a Livingston core, and it's likely not the complete record. The chronology for this core was based on 5 radiocarbon dates from stratigraphic charcoal. 2 radiocarbon dates from stratigraphic charcoal were rejected, and this one also included a plutonium activity profile. On to the pollen and charcoal results. There were 4 pollen zones identified within the Lake Pasture record, and these largely correspond with local cultural records. Zone LP1 corresponded to the early and middle Archaic, LP2 to the late Archaic and Basket-Maker 2, LP3 to Basket-Maker 2 and late prehistoric, and LP4 to the historic. At Meadow Canyon, for pollen and charcoal, 4 pollen zones were identified. These also largely corresponded with local cultural records. MC1 corresponded to Basket-Maker 2, MC2 to Basket-Maker 2, 3, and Pueblo 1, MC3 to Pueblo 1, 2, and 3, and MC4 to Pueblo 3, the late prehistoric and the historic. For the middens, we collected 11 middens and 12 radiocarbon dates. These middens were separated into 3 different series. The first series was the Terrace series. This was representative of the mesa to the north of the site, the coring location, and it contained Basket-Maker 3, Pueblo 2, and late prehistoric aged middens. The Cliff series was representative of the cliffs and foothills between the coring location and the mesa to the north. And this contained late Archaic, Pueblo 2, and late prehistoric middens. And then finally, the floodplain series, which was representative of the Meadow Canyon floodplain, and it contained Pueblo 3, late prehistoric, and historic middens. A number of culturally important taxa were recovered from the core and the pack rat middens. These dated to Basket-Maker 2, 3, Pueblo 1, 2, and 3, and late prehistoric times. Okay, so on to a discussion of the results. Main takeaways are that our sediment recovered at least the last 8,900 cal year for Lake Pasture and to around 4,100 cal year BP for Meadow Canyon. Holocene vegetation and fire reconstructions for each site indicate that paleo environments responded to natural climatic variability, but also strongly reflect human land use. And these records are important because they first provide the first continuous baseline of fire and vegetation spanning back to the Middle Holocene for pinyon juniper woodlands on the Colorado Plateau. Second, provide evidence of agriculture throughout formative and late prehistoric times at Meadow Canyon. Third, demonstrate the utility of non-invasive methods of archaeology in the form of sediment cores and pack rat middens. And last, support National Register of Historic Places eligibility for archaeological sites surrounding each core location. On to a discussion of Lake Pasture during the Middle Holocene. starting around 8,900 cal-year BP, accumulation of the basin began. Closing of the basin was complete around 7,350 cal-year BP, and at this time it was dominated by an open juniper woodland with a diverse herbaceous understory. Around 4,600 cal-year BP, the abundance of juniper decreased and shrubs and herbs increased. This coincides with evidence of increased effective moisture regionally and on nearby plateaus at this time. At around 2,300 cal-year BP, heightened charcoal influx contemporaneous with juniper decline and Pinus edulis and Poaceae increase. And this corresponds to a long-term Pinus edulis increase beginning approximately 3,000 years ago, which is widespread regional phenomenon. And also during Basket Maker 2 times, when horticulture, the bow and arrow, and pit house agriculture or architecture first appear in the regional archaeological record. Turning to the late Holocene, from 2200 to 215 cal-year BP, the landscape transitioned to a juniper pinyon woodland. And elsewhere at this time, evidence suggests that humans used low-severity burning techniques to propagate edible wild food resources such as amaranth and Poaceae in mixed conifer ecosystems. During Basket Maker 2, we have increases in juniper, decreases in populace, and increases in shrubs and herbs. During the early formative, we have pinyon pine, shrubs, and Amaranthaceae increasing while juniper and grasses decrease. During the late formative, we have a lack of charcoal, an increase in juniper and grass, and sage was steady. And then during the late prehistoric, abandonment of 50 Mile Mountain by formative agricultural is followed by dramatic increases in woodland density, charcoal influx, and sediment accumulation rate. Non-economic plants increased while important food species decreased, and this likely represents secondary succession of trees and shrubs following the cessation of human-induced low-severity burning on the understory, as also documented on Mesa Verde and the Grand Canyon South Rim. Historically, there are unprecedented declines in juniper, increases in herbs, as well as increases in pinyon pine. These rapid changes suggest that the modern ecosystem present on 50 Mile Mountain is unlike any in the past, likely a result of grazing and associated land clearance on the landscape. And then just a couple of repeat photos on the top. There's a photo from 1915 of around the coring location, and on the bottom there's a photo from 2012 that I took. And it shows that there's more vegetation cover on the uplands in 2012. On to Meadow Canyon. During the Middle Holocene, peat began accumulating around 4,100 cal-year BP, and around 2,300 cal-year BP stabilization reoccurred. For the late Holocene, from 2,300 to 1,600 cal-year BP, an open juniper woodland with an understory of grasses, amaranth, and ambrosia occurred. Charcoal influx was at its highest during the record, and erosion into the basin was relatively high. At around 1,600 cal-year BP to the present, the site has been characterized by an open juniper pinyon woodland with an understory of amaranth, ambrosia, grass, and Sycamore-Acacia. During Basket Maker 3, char was greatly reduced. There are increases in disturbance taxa and decreases in grass and ambrosia. During Pueblo 1, there was reduced charcoal influx, decreased juniper in the periods of Plantago, as well as high Sycamore-Acacia, as well as Phaseolus pollen, which shows cultivation of Meadow Canyon. During Pueblo 2, the Terrace series midden pollen shows that corn and bean were cultivated on the mesa to the north, and the Cliff series midden pollen show that bean was cultivated on ridges between Meadow Canyon and the mesa to the north. During Pueblo 3, floodplain series midden pollen show that corn and helianthus were cultivated within Meadow Canyon. And during the late prehistoric, char was reduced, pinyon pine increased, while disturbance plants decreased. You have bean and helianthus cultivated on the mesa to the north, and helianthus cultivated on ridges between Meadow Canyon and the mesa to the north. Historically, Meadow Canyon remained a juniper pinyon woodland with a denser understory. Charcoal influx was relatively low, and there was increased erosion. And here's also some repeat photography showing 1872 on the top, 1984 in the middle, and 2014 in the bottom. Picture that I took on the bottom, which shows that there's been much more land clearance and development since back in the 1800s. Conclusions. Answering the research questions. Number one, how do vegetation and fire histories differ over the elevational ranges of the sites? Marked differences in vegetation and fire histories exist between the high and low elevation sites. At Lake Pasture, juniper woodlands have existed on 50 Mile Mountain since around 7350 cal-year BP. First, primarily as an open woodland during the arid Middle Holocene, then increasing in abundance with increased moisture availability during the late Holocene, and then experiencing historic declines in juniper and increases in pinyon pine, unprecedented in the record. Charcoal influx also reduced during formative times, significantly increased during the transition from the medieval climate anomaly to the Little Ice Age, and then reduced historically. At Middle Canyon, the record does not extend in the Middle Holocene. However, juniper woodlands have existed around Middle Canyon since approximately 2300 cal-year BP. First in the form of an open woodland from 2300 to 1600 cal-year BP, and that is an open juniper pinyon woodland from 1600 cal-year BP to the present. Charcoal influx at this location was much higher during basket maker 2 times compared to the rest of the record. Second, what do the records reveal about prehistoric agriculture? Direct evidence of prehistoric agriculture at Meadow Canyon, but not at Lake Pasture. At Meadow Canyon, we have evidence of agriculture throughout formative and late prehistoric times. Evidence of heightened agricultural use by the virgin Brant's ancestral Puebloan population from 500 to 1300 CE. At Lake Pasture, there's no direct evidence of agriculture, despite local archaeology suggesting the presence of agriculture in this area during the formative. But rather than suggesting a lack of agriculture in this location, we suggest this is a result of sampling bias and/or poor pollen preservation in the sedimentary record. And last, what is the relative impact of natural climate variability and human land use through time in southern Utah? The environmental response to human land management forcing overrides climate variability, at least partially. This suggests that indigenous fire practices and land management likely played an important role in shaping environments at both sites for the past around 1700 years. Formative settlement altered vegetation composition and fire in the monument. Results of the fire records are especially striking with radical differences in charcoal influx at each site. And last, 50 Mile Mountain landscape was greatly affected by historic livestock grazing. I'm going to end with some acknowledgements. And I thank you all for your time, and please feel free to reach out with any questions regarding our study. Last, this paper is dedicated to Ken Cole, who helped inspire this research, but passed away unexpectedly during the final stages of writing. Take care.